Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to discuss with you what I affectionately like to call the new rules of success. Now, I wrote a Facebook post about this back in early 2020, and I think it's a really interesting topic to think about, which is how, largely due to the digital age, the world is changing. And what this means is that a lot of the old conventional wisdom that we're used to hearing, the advice that we're used to getting, the sources of information out there, in this particular case about how to succeed, may not be valid or are less valid today. Now, these particular things I'm going to talk about today are, kind of centered around financial success, but the truth is they can apply to a variety of different types of success. So maybe before we get started, I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think would be the new rules of success? Meaning things that aren't what people were saying for the last 100 years, but they've become important, become significant if you want to maximize your results in life today because of how the world has changed. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Thank you for your support. If you'd like help with the subjects we deal with here, as usual, which are international revocation, setting up businesses around the world, basically kind of residency arbitrage, figure out the best solution for yourself, as well as implementation of that solution, please reach out to us. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Now, with that in mind, the context here is, if you go and read kind of writings, self-help, ancient wisdom, various different coaches and gurus and all of this, you'll notice there's a bunch of consistently repeated topics. These might be work hard, think long term, have integrity, add value, et cetera, right? So there's a variety of different things. And I think some of this obviously has, pervasive applicability. I don't think that it's a good idea not to work hard, and I don't think it's a good idea not to have integrity, etc. But the world is definitely a different place. And as a result, some of these things, maybe it's not that they have gone away, but they've changed in terms of their application, or there's some other thing that tends to be a pervading, overarching factor. And for me, this was a big thing. Back when I started my second company years and years ago, one of the things I set out to do was to kind of learn and understand business and success and grow my skills. I figured maybe I would fail at business, but at least nobody could take the skills away from me. And I went on kind of this journey to try and understand. I built mental models of how things should work and cataloged skills, etc. And what I discovered through that was actually a lot of it was kind of deeply unsatisfying. Even though I had this kind of rubric of skills that was organized really nicely, I would see people who were having consistent breakthrough success at a much higher level. And there was something missing in the alchemy of the formula that I had been taught or that I'd picked up along the way. And it was as I started to consider these new rules of success and pay attention to friends who were, like I said, consistently doing well, that this came to mind. So I don't know that this is a super strong, well-organized analysis, but I will attempt to go through it for you and go from there. Now, I will say up front, I don't necessarily like these rules. These are not derived because I think that, hey, they're so attractive or so wonderful or anything. It's more about just recognizing the way that the world is today. And based on how the world is, if you want to succeed, you kind of have to accept, hey, this is the way that it is, and then how do I work with that? So with that in mind, let's get started. The first rule that I would say is think short term. So we have this, what I sometimes call the cult of long-term thinking. And obviously there's some merit to long-term thinking, certainly to making sure that you don't expose yourself to long-term risk that may destroy your short-term results. But let's just consider things historically. Back in the time of John D Rockefeller, he became the first billionaire, and it took him about 40 years to do that, which at the time was actually pretty quick, given that it never happened before, but was not that different than Napoleon or Genghis Khan or various different people who had built from very low levels up to high levels. It took a long time. And as a result, you had to think long term in order to achieve a high degree of success. Fast forward to today. I mean, the startup Bird went $0 to $1 billion valuation in less than a year. Most recently, a company called Picasso went $0 to $1 billion in 5 months. In crypto, it goes faster than this sometimes. And in that highly accelerated world, you're in a situation where the value of short-term thinking has never been greater. So I think that people often underestimate, when they're kind of teaching this historic stuff, just how much can go into accumulating value short-term. And there were a lot of cases where I've made mistakes because I've thought, oh, there's this trend, but it's not sustainable, it's gonna die. You know, maybe it'll be here for a few years, but then it's gonna go away. That was a mistake. The truth is, I would have been better off jumping on that trend, doing really well for a period of a few years, could have made a few $1 million, now you've got a few $1 million to translate into the next one, and so on and so forth. So very, very useful to think short term, even though this is not necessarily what we've been taught. This flows into the next thing, which I think is understanding that value or success is realized principally through scale, not through effectiveness. A good example of this is, it's shocking how many big businesses are incredibly poorly run. Before I had exposure to that, when I was just early getting started, I thought, oh, you know, best managed companies in the country or best managed companies in the world, wow, they must be run really well. And what you find is that almost all these companies are deeply dysfunctional and deranged. They're hyper inefficient in many different regards, but it doesn't prevent them from making billions of dollars in profit. And the reason of this is, you know, they can overcome a lot through doing a few things well and getting large scale, okay? So let's use an example of an incredibly successful person who gets a lot of credit for the wrong things, even though I quite appreciate him in a bunch of regards, and this is Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is a billionaire. He runs the world's largest hedge fund, and you know, clearly has a bunch of success. And the truth is, his investing track record isn't that good. If you just look on percentage basis over time, it's not that stellar, especially if you look over since kind of from 2009. But yet, he has made more money than many, many other people and built a great reputation, etc. What is this attributable to? It's more about his ability to scale up his portfolio of clients than it is about increasing his returns. So I think a lot of times I would obsess with, okay, you know, how do I get 5% a year better returns than these other people? And the result was, you know, great, you get 5% a year better, but it would have been much better off to simply go and scale up the volume of money that was working with you by a factor of 10 and keep the same numbers, and it would have been, it's just a much easier path and a path that yields much better results. And we've never been in a situation in the world where it is easier to scale up due to digitization, due to globalization, etc. So very useful to note that. The next thing that might kind of recognize is that value, that you don't need to add value, okay? So there's a narrative that is out there, and it's a nice narrative, which is, you know, the amount of money you make will be directly in proportion to the amount of value you add. And this is basically nonsense. It's pretty much not true. There are all kinds of people who do incredibly well. I know somebody who, in a period of about 2 years, went from very little, close to nothing, to about $18 million, and did it purely through essentially arbitrage trading. And this adds literally zero value to the world. You're talking about a zero-sum game when you're in this situation, but they did it. And so you discover that actually what has value today is principally two things, or at least that which derives value, derives kind of gain, is principally two things. One is attention, okay? Being able to get attention is incredibly valuable. Number two is arbitrage, okay? Let's use a really quick example of the first. You have Kylie Jenner, okay? Kylie Jenner built a company that she sold after just a couple of years, half of approximately, for $600 million, giving a valuation of $1.2 billion with 7 people, okay? 7 people on the team. And how did she do that? Well, she has a really big social media following. She knows how to get attention. So that turned out to have this really big impact even though was the product especially good? Not particularly. Was, there especially, big gain for people? No, but very, very good at getting attention. And if I look, most of the young people who I know who have been very successful have done so through some sort of marketing, right? Marketing has been this massive thing. Why? Because it's gotten easier and easier to get a product, a service, etc., and harder to get the audience because there's more competition for them. Pretty simple. The other side is the arbitrage, right? As I mentioned earlier, you have these cases where just by being able to grab a little gain between two markets, for example, a lot of people in drop shipping, right? What are they doing? They're buying on AliExpress, they're selling through some sort of drop shipping thing locally, or they're selling on Amazon. It's more and more easy to build up a big differential quite simply because of the fact that you can capitalize on these arbitrages. And there's many of them, right? So finding opportunities of arbitrage, which you might say are their own form of value, but it's different sort of value than you might see in a bunch of cases. And in some cases, there's no value at all, as I said, like if you're trading stocks or commodities or crypto or whatever, right? No value add in the trading process. So that's kind of interesting. The thing that comes out of this is what you discover is that riding trends is really, really important. So this would be, I guess, on our number 4 kind of new rule of success. Getting on trends has never been more important. Now again, I'm somebody who, I hate trends. I am kind of very anti-trend, and I really missed out on a lot of good opportunities because of being anti-trends for quite a long period of time. And it took me looking at some other people who were having consistent success and talking to them and discovering that they put a lot of effort into identifying what they would describe as the next wave. Now, again, you think about this from a historic standpoint. Historically, it didn't really work that well to chase trends. Why? Because you had to put out a lot of capital and go through a lot of effort in order to capitalize on that trend. And if it wasn't going to last, there was a good chance that you didn't recoup your investment. Fast forward to today. Today, it's really quicker and easier than ever in order to kind of build up some base, and therefore you can get really, really far. When you jump on a trend, what you discover, because something is new, a couple things are true. One is your competition is lower. There's just less people who are experts in it. And so the need for specialization is not there to the same extent as if you were to go into some complex field. You can look at research in this regard on deliberate practice. There's a kind of really famous adage that's been put together from Malcolm Gladwell in the book Outliers, the 10,000 hour rule. And the 10,000 hour rule, it turns out, is actually mostly nonsense in terms of 10,000 hours. What you discover is if you're looking at theoretical physics or chess or something, a field that has been really well expanded upon, it's probably more like 20,000 hours. But if you go into some new field, maybe it's only 5,000 hours or 3,000 hours. So you get this ability to get involved and excel against the competition really quickly in a newer field. At the same time, a rising tide raises all ships. And so I have a really good friend who's done very, very well in multiple projects, who kind of was one of the people who really put me on this. And he would point out that you can work half as hard and do 10 times as well if you're being able to catch that wave than if you're just in a normal situation, let alone one where it's collapsing against you. You have to work really, really hard and you don't get the same payoff. So very, very important to understand and jump on these trends. The next thing that I think is worth noting, I think we're on number 5, is the importance of first order thinking and really obvious gains. So there's this concept, and I enjoy second order thinking. I think it's, you get a better view of the world that way. But if you want to have big success, first order thinking and obvious opportunities are often much more valuable. I talked to a friend of mine who's really, really smart guy, very, very sophisticated in terms of financial markets, in terms of understanding various different instruments and trading strategies and so on and so forth. And it's like this enormous amount of brain power to gain like a couple % edge in the market. And then I look at somebody else who comes along and they make a bet on something that, the sophistication is not so high, but the gains are much higher. You can see, for example, people who jumped in crypto at the beginning of 2017, say, right? In the course of a year, they may have had hundreds of % return, and they weren't that smart. They weren't in a situation where they did really sophisticated analysis. They really didn't have deep multi-order thinking, etc. But they got returns that blew away most traditional fund managers by a factor of several, like maybe their entire career returns would equal what came about in a year there. And so I think the problem with going for second and third order thinking and really nuanced analysis, as much as I enjoy it, I mentioned some of it here, and there's some places where it's really important. For example, if we're talking about tax, you need to have that, right? You need to have very nuanced analysis. But when you're making, choosing opportunities, the problem with this is we're really bad at being highly precise. We tend to make a lot of mistakes. It's difficult to make good predictions. And so if your margin of safety is just a few %, it's really easy to get knocked out. If you're going for the 10x opportunity instead of the 2% opportunity, then even you have a lot of margin where you can still be wrong and it will work out in your favor. So going for the really obvious gains and first order opportunities often has this big payoff. And what this means is you have to be patient, right? You have to kind of spend the time looking around for it and not taking advantage of these others. But it really has an inordinate amount of payoff. And so it's kind of, you can sit there waiting for quite a while and just looking out, but then when you find that opportunity, it has such a big payoff that it's more than worth it on a risk to reward basis. This brings me to the last thing, which is thinking in terms of probabilities. So this is, I think, a really highly underappreciated skill and practice. We kind of came from a world that was pretty simple, where it was easy to know what was going on. You probably lived in a small environment, in a small town. There wasn't that much going on. There weren't that many professions. There wasn't that much complexity. Now we live in a big, globally interconnected, digitalized world with immense complexity and far-reaching effects that go one into the other. And it's much more difficult to have that certainty. So in order to deal with that, one of the best ways to operate is to be able to think in terms of probabilities rather than very deterministically or in terms of certainties, and then weigh out those probabilities based on kind of some of the other things that I was mentioning here. So anyway, those are some interesting ideas that maybe you'll take something from. I hope you do. And I would love to hear your comments. So I will look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.